The illusion. You were meant to believe. There is a moment after the damage is done that feels more unsettling than the betrayal itself. It's not the argument. It's not the harsh words. It's not even the way they walked away. It's what comes after. The silence, the calm, the unnerving composure. You replay the scene in your mind at 3 in the morning while they appear to move on as if nothing happened. No apology, no explanation, no visible remorse, just distance, coldness. A look that seems to say, "This never mattered." And slowly, almost imperceptibly, a thought begins to take root inside you. Maybe it really didn't matter. Maybe I didn't matter. This is the illusion you were meant to believe. Most people assume that when a narcissist hurts you and then appears unaffected, it's because they are emotionally superior, detached, or strong, that they possess some rare inner discipline you lack, that while you're unraveling, they're at peace. That interpretation feels devastating, and it's wrong. What you're witnessing is not peace, it's not strength, it's not clarity, it's a performance. And it's one of the most psychologically sophisticated deceptions you will ever encounter. Because the narcissist's calm is not evidence of emotional freedom, it is evidence of emotional avoidance. A carefully maintained illusion designed to do one thing above all else: redirect the pain away from themselves and deposit it squarely inside you. Silence becomes their weapon, indifference becomes their shield. And your confusion becomes the collateral damage. They know something most people don't consciously recognize. When someone refuses to react after causing harm, even the injured party will instinctively turn inward. You stop asking the "why did they do this?" and start asking the "what's wrong with me?" That shift is not accidental. It is the true aftermath of narcissistic injury. You are meant to walk away doubting your reality. You were meant to question your memory, your instincts, your worth. You were meant to interpret their composure as proof that you overreacted, that you imagined the depth of the connection, that the pain was one-sided. But here is the uncomfortable truth most people never tell you. The narcissist is not calm because they don't feel. They are calm because they cannot afford to feel. Beneath that still exterior is not emotional emptiness, but emotional overload. A volatile inner landscape filled with shame, fear, and a deep terror of being exposed as inadequate. Their personality structure was built precisely to avoid those feelings, to keep them buried, to keep them out of conscious awareness. When they hurt you, something dangerous happens internally. Not guilt in the healthy sense, not the kind that leads to accountability, but a flash of threat. A threat to the carefully constructed image they rely on to survive. If they allow themselves to acknowledge your pain, they must also acknowledge their role in causing it, and that acknowledgement would crack the foundation of who they believe themselves to be. So instead, they do what they've always done. They disappear emotionally. They retreat behind the mask. They act untouched. This is not indifference born of confidence. It is indifference born of fear, fear of being wrong, fear of being flawed, fear of seeing themselves clearly. And so the illusion hardens. The colder they appear, the more you assume they've moved on. The quieter they become, the louder your self-doubt grows. The more composed they seem, the more fractured you feel. That asymmetry is the illusion's power. But here is what no one tells you while you're trapped inside it. Their silence is not proof that you were insignificant. It is proof that you mattered enough to threaten their internal equilibrium. If you truly meant nothing, there would be no need for the performance. People who are secure don't need to erase others to remain intact. They don't need to deny impact. They don't need to act untouched. They can tolerate discomfort. They can sit with guilt. They can face the consequences of their behavior without collapsing. The narcissist cannot. So they choose illusion over truth, detachment over reflection, silence over accountability. And you are left holding the weight of a reality they refuse to carry. This is where the story usually breaks people. They confuse the absence of reaction with the absence of consequence. They interpret composure as peace. They mistake emotional withdrawal for closure. But the illusion is fragile. It requires constant maintenance. And beneath it is not serenity, but tension, unresolved, buried, and unspoken. What you're seeing is not the end of the story, it's the beginning of the revelation. Because everything that follows, the control, the envy, the escalation, the fear of your healing, all of it traces back to this first deception. The illusion you were meant to believe so that they would never have to confront what they did. And if this perspective already feels unsettling, stay with me. Because as we peel back the layers, you'll begin to see that the narrative you've been telling yourself is incomplete, and that the truth is far more empowering than you've been led to believe. Before we continue, if this resonates with you, if you've ever felt destabilized by someone's cold silence after they hurt you, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps support the work here and allows us to keep creating content that brings clarity to experiences most people struggle to name. Now let me ask you a question, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Quick question. After they hurt you and went silent, what affected you more? A. The pain of what they did. B. The confusion caused by how unaffected they seemed. Comment A or B below. What they want you to think after the damage. After the silence settles, after the emotional door closes without explanation, something far more insidious begins to unfold. The narcissist doesn't just leave you with pain. They leave you with a story. And that story, if left unchallenged, slowly rewires how you see yourself. They want you to believe that the ending was inevitable. That what happened says something fundamental about you. That you were difficult. That you asked for too much. That you misunderstood the connection. That your expectations were unrealistic. That your pain is proof of your weakness, not their actions. This is not accidental. This is where the real damage occurs. Narcissists understand something most people don't consciously articulate. Human beings make sense of suffering by assigning meaning to it. When there is no explanation offered, the mind fills in the gaps. And in relationships marked by power imbalance, the mind almost always turns inward. You don't just ask, why did this happen? You ask, what does this say about me? That question is the psychological prize thereafter. They want you to conclude that you were disposable, that the bond you felt was one-sided, that your emotional investment was naive or embarrassing, that their ability to move on reflects clarity, while your lingering pain reflects deficiency. And if you accept that narrative, something crucial happens. Their behavior no longer needs to be examined. Responsibility quietly shifts. The spotlight moves away from their choices and lands on your perceived flaws. In marriages, long-term relationships, workplaces, even families, this pattern plays out with devastating consistency. When someone exits without accountability, and when they refuse to engage in repair or reflection, the person left behind often assumes the absence of explanation means the truth must be too obvious to state. If they didn't fight for this, it must not have been worth fighting for. That assumption feels logical. It's also deeply misleading. Because what the narcissist is doing is not disengaging from the relationship alone. They are disengaging from the shared reality you once occupied together. And by doing so, they quietly invalidate your experience without ever having to contradict it openly. This is narrative control. They don't need to say, "You were nothing to me." They just need to act as if that were true. And over time, you begin to internalize the message. You replay conversations, searching for the moment you crossed some invisible line. You second-guess your reactions. You downplay your own hurt. You rewrite history to make their withdrawal make sense. Maybe I was too emotional. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe I misread everything. This is not closure, it's erosion. What makes this particularly damaging is that the narcissist rarely presents themselves as overtly cruel in this phase. They aren't screaming, they aren't attacking. They may even appear polite, calm, or distant in a way that seems almost respectful. That demeanor reinforces the illusion that they are simply done, while you are stuck. But this interpretation ignores a critical psychological reality. People who are genuinely secure don't need others to question their worth in order to move on. They can acknowledge impact without becoming consumed by it. They can say, implicitly or explicitly, "This didn't work, and I'm sorry for the pain involved." The narcissist cannot do this, not because they don't understand the pain, but because acknowledging it threatens their internal structure. So instead, they leave you with ambiguity. Ambiguity is powerful because it forces you to carry both sides of the emotional equation. You hold your pain and their silence, your grief and their apparent ease. And because humans are meaning-making creatures, you begin to assign significance to the imbalance itself. If they're fine and I'm not, something must be wrong with me. That conclusion is the outcome they depend on. It allows them to walk away without reckoning. It protects their self-image. And it ensures that even in absence, they remain psychologically dominant, not through presence, but through the story you tell yourself about the ending. But here's what's rarely acknowledged. The narcissist's indifference is not neutral, it's communicative. It sends a message without using words, and the message is designed to compress a complex relational dynamic into a single devastating implication. You didn't matter enough. That implication is false. But it's effective, because if you accept it, you begin to diminish yourself. You stop trusting your perceptions. You hesitate to name harm in future relationships. You carry forward a quieter version of yourself, one that is more cautious, less expressive, more self-blaming. In other words, the narrative doesn't just explain the past, it shapes the future. And that is why this stage is so important to understand. What they want you to think after the damage is not just about absolving themselves. It's about preserving a hierarchy where they remain untouched and you remain uncertain. Where they appear resolved and you appear reactive. Where their silence feels authoritative and your pain feels inconvenient. But narratives built on avoidance always crack under scrutiny. Because the truth is this, people who genuinely believe you were insignificant don't need you to feel small. They don't need you to question your reality. They don't need to erase the past in order to survive it. The need to control the story after the damage reveals something crucial, not about your worth, but about their fragility. If you mattered so little, there would be no need to disappear so completely. If the connection were meaningless, it wouldn't require such careful denial. If the impact were irrelevant, they wouldn't need you to doubt yourself, and the story they want you to tell yourself is incomplete. And as we continue, you'll begin to see that what looks like detachment is often dependency in disguise, a reliance on your confusion to stabilize their sense of self. The moment you stop asking what their silence says about you and start asking what it protects them from, the narrative begins to shift. The emotional core. They never show. To understand what truly drives a narcissist, you have to let go of the idea that they are empty inside. That belief is comforting, but it's inaccurate. The truth is far more unsettling. The narcissist is not hollow. They are flooded. Their inner world is not quiet. It is loud, unstable, and overwhelming. What you never saw, what they worked tirelessly to conceal, is an emotional core they do not know how to live inside without collapsing. And at the center of their psychology is not confidence, but fragility. Not self-assurance, but fear. Long before you entered their life, they learned something about themselves that felt unbearable, that their worth was conditional, unstable, or insufficient. Whether through early neglect, inconsistent validation, humiliation, or emotional unpredictability, they internalized a belief that being fully seen was dangerous. And so they adapted, not by healing, but by constructing a self that could not be wounded. This is the origin of the narcissistic structure. It is not built to feel deeply. It is built to avoid feeling deeply. Shame sits at the core of this system, not the everyday shame that passes through and softens into insight, but a corrosive identity-level shame. The kind that whispers, if someone truly sees you, they will reject you. For the narcissist, this shame is not an emotion they experience occasionally. It is a constant background threat, humming beneath the surface, waiting to be triggered. And they are acutely sensitive to that trigger. This is why their emotional responses appear disproportionate or strangely absent. When something brushes against that buried shame, criticism, disappointment, vulnerability, another person's pain, it doesn't register as a single feeling. It registers as danger. The system floods, the nervous system spikes, the psyche scrambles to protect itself. But instead of turning inward, they turn outward. They deflect. They minimize, they detach, not because they don't feel, but because feeling threatens their psychological survival. What you never witnessed was the internal chaos that followed moments of emotional intimacy. Even when closeness deepened, when you expressed genuine care, when you expected reciprocity. Those moments didn't create safety for them, they created pressure. Connection demands presence. Presence demands authenticity. Authenticity risks exposure, and exposure is the one thing they cannot tolerate. So rather than letting emotion move through them, they shut it down. They fragment it, they bury it. They present a version of themselves that appears composed, decisive, even dominant. But that presentation is not the absence of emotion. It is the result of relentless emotional suppression. Imagine trying to hold a beach ball underwater indefinitely. The effort is constant, exhausting. And if your grip slips for even a moment, it explodes to the surface. That is what the narcissist lives with internally, a perpetual effort to keep unwanted feelings submerged. Fear of inadequacy, fear of abandonment, fear of being ordinary, fear of being exposed as flawed. These emotions don't disappear, they accumulate. This accumulation is why narcissists often oscillate between emotional distance and emotional intensity, between detachment and control, between charm and cruelty. The system cannot regulate itself organically, so it compensates through extremes, and here is where many people misunderstand what happened between you and them. When you were hurt, when you needed acknowledgement, when you sought understanding, you assumed that their lack of response meant lack of feeling. But in reality, your pain activated their deepest fears. It wasn't that they didn't register it, and it was that they registered it too strongly and had no capacity to metabolize it. Your pain implied impact. Impact implied responsibility. Responsibility implied fault, and fault leads straight to shame. So the system shut down, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. This does not excuse the harm, but it explains the pattern. The narcissist's emotional core is organized around avoidance, not connection. Every behavior, every deflection, every silence, every cold withdrawal is in service of maintaining equilibrium. They are not striving for closeness. They are striving for stability. And stability for them means never having to confront the parts of themselves they've disowned. This is why emotional conversations go nowhere, why accountability feels impossible, why moments that require humility trigger defensiveness or disappearance. The emotional equipment required to stay present simply isn't there. They were never taught how to feel without imploding. And because they cannot tolerate their own vulnerability, they cannot tolerate yours either. When you expressed pain, you weren't just asking to be understood. You were inadvertently asking them to access a part of themselves that has been sealed off for decades. a part associated with helplessness, dependency, and shame. That request felt impossible, so instead of meeting you there, they retreated into what they know: control, distance, superiority, indifference. This is also why narcissists often appear emotionally mature on the surface, but profoundly immature underneath. They may articulate feelings, mirror empathy, or speak insightfully. But these are cognitive performances, not embodied experiences. They understand emotions intellectually, not relationally. They can describe them without inhabiting them. And when emotions can't be inhabited, they become threatening. What you encountered was not a lack of emotion, but a lack of emotional integration. A fragmented inner world held together by image, validation, and avoidance. A structure that looks solid until pressure is applied, then reveals its brittleness. Understanding this shifts something important. It removes the fantasy that you could have explained yourself better, loved harder, or been more patient and somehow accessed their emotional core. That core is not hidden behind effort. It is protected by fear, and fear does not yield to persuasion. And the narcissist did not withhold emotion because you failed to earn it. They withheld it because they do not know how to survive it. And this realization, while painful, is clarifying. It tells you that what you were asking for, mutual emotional presence, was never available in the way you needed it to be. Not because you were unworthy, but because the structure you were engaging with was not built for reciprocity. Their emotional core exists. It is active, it is volatile, but it is not accessible without dismantling the defenses that keep it contained, and that dismantling is a journey they rarely choose. As we move forward, you'll begin to see how this hidden emotional core shapes everything that follows: the envy, the control, the fear of your independence. Because once you understand what they are protecting themselves from, their behavior stops feeling random. It becomes tragically consistent. Shame, the emotion they are running from. If there is one emotion the narcissist organizes their entire life around avoiding, it is shame. Not embarrassment, not guilt. Shame in its deepest form, the kind that doesn't say I did something wrong, but there is something wrong with me. This is the emotional fault line beneath everything you experienced, and it is the reason accountability feels impossible, not inconvenient. Shame for the narcissist is not an emotion that passes through and resolves. It is an existential threat. It attacks identity, not behavior. And because their sense of self was built to survive rather than to integrate, even a brief encounter with shame feels catastrophic. It doesn't invite reflection, it triggers collapse. This is why they run. To understand this, you have to recognize that most healthy people can tolerate shame in small, digestible doses. It's uncomfortable, but it's also instructive. It points us toward repair. It allows us to say, I messed up, without concluding, I am irredeemable. That capacity to separate behavior from identity is what makes growth possible. The narcissist never developed that separation. Somewhere early in their psychological development, shame became fused with survival. Mistakes were not met with guidance. Vulnerability was not met with safety. Being wrong did not lead to correction. It led to humiliation, rejection, or loss of standing. Over time, the nervous system learned a brutal equation. To be flawed is to be endangered, so the psyche adapted. Instead of metabolizing shame, it learned to deflect it. And instead of holding responsibility, it learned to outsource blame. Instead of repairing ruptures, it learned to deny them. This wasn't a conscious decision. It was a survival strategy that hardened into identity. This is why moments that require accountability feel so volatile around a narcissist. When harm is named, calmly, clearly, without accusation, it doesn't land as information. It lands as exposure. And exposure activates the deepest fear they carry, being seen as fundamentally inadequate. So they respond the only way they know how. They minimize, They rationalize, they disappear, or they attack. None of these responses are about the situation in front of them. They are about escaping the internal experience that situation threatens to evoke. This is also why apologies, when they appear, often feel hollow or transactional. A genuine apology requires staying present with discomfort. It requires holding the image of oneself as the cause of another person's pain without self-destruction. It requires humility. For the narcissist, humility feels indistinguishable from annihilation. So they offer substitutes. "I'm sorry you feel that way. That wasn't my intention. Let's not dwell on the past." These phrases function as exits. They sound conciliatory, but they carefully avoid the one thing that would activate shame: ownership. Because ownership would mean standing still in a place they've spent their entire lives fleeing. You may have noticed how quickly conversations shut down when accountability approaches, how defensiveness replaces curiosity, how calm discussion suddenly becomes impossible. This is not because they lack intelligence or insight. It's because shame hijacks the system. The moment it appears on the horizon, the defenses deploy automatically. And here is the part that is often hardest to accept. Your pain was not ignored because it was insignificant. It was avoided because it was powerful enough to pierce the illusion they depend on to function. Your hurt implied that they had caused damage, and damage implies fault, and fault implies shame. So instead of moving toward repair, they move toward erasure. They rewrite the story. They recast themselves as misunderstood. They recast you as unreasonable. This reframing is not simply manipulation. It is emotional anesthesia. It dulls the internal threat long enough for them to regain equilibrium. But that equilibrium comes at a cost, because shame that is never faced does not disappear. It sinks. It becomes subterranean. And buried shame doesn't soften. It sharpens. It turns into resentment, defensiveness, and a chronic need to feel superior. It fuels the compulsion to be right, to be admired, to be untouchable. In this way, the narcissist's avoidance of shame paradoxically ensures its persistence. And this is why change is so rare. Healing would require turning toward the very emotion they've structured their lives to avoid. It would require dismantling the defenses that keep shame at bay. It would require grieving the false self they built to survive. That process is not just uncomfortable. It feels life-threatening. So they choose familiarity over growth. They choose the known pain of illusion over the unknown responsibility of truth. They choose distance over reckoning. They choose silence over self-examination. And you are left standing at the edge of a conversation they will not enter. This is where many people turn inward and assume they asked for too much, that their expectations were unreasonable, that wanting accountability was a flaw. It wasn't. Wanting acknowledgement is not a character defect. It is a sign of psychological health. The absence of accountability does not mean the absence of conscience. It means the conscience has been walled off to protect the ego. The narcissist's fear of shame is precisely what keeps their inner world frozen in place. And this understanding offers something crucial. It tells you that no amount of perfect wording, patience, or emotional restraint would have made them suddenly capable of sitting with shame. This was never about your delivery, it was about their capacity. Shame cannot be negotiated with. It must be faced. And the narcissist has built their entire identity around ensuring they never have to do that. As we continue, you'll begin to see how this avoidance doesn't just affect accountability, it shapes how they respond to your pain, your growth, and eventually your independence. Because when someone cannot face shame, they will do almost anything to avoid the conditions that might evoke it, including trying to control the people closest to them. The performance after they hurt you. After the moment has passed, after the words land, the betrayal registers, the rupture is undeniable. Something peculiar happens. The narcissist does not respond the way most people would. There is no visible reckoning, no pause heavy with remorse, no visible attempt to understand the impact. Instead, what emerges is a performance so subtle and controlled that it can feel more disorienting than the harm itself. They become calm, not reflective calm, not the quiet of someone processing regret, but a composed stillness that feels rehearsed. You may notice the shift immediately. Their voice lowers, their expressions flatten, their presence turns distant, almost abstract. It's as if an invisible curtain drops between you and them, sealing off whatever just occurred. And standing there on the other side of that curtain, you're left holding the emotional weight alone. This is not withdrawal. This is stagecraft. The performance after they hurt you is one of the most misunderstood aspects of narcissistic behavior. It is easy to assume that the coldness is indifference, that the calm is resolution, that the silence is a sign they've moved on. But what you are witnessing is not the absence of feeling. It is the deliberate management of perception. Because at this point, the narcissist is no longer responding to the relationship. They are responding to threat. Once harm has occurred, they face a dilemma. If they acknowledge what happened, they risk activating guilt, shame, and accountability. If they react emotionally, they risk exposure. If they engage honestly, they risk losing control of the narrative. So instead, they step into a role that protects all three at once. They perform indifference. This performance serves several psychological functions simultaneously. First, it distances them from the emotional consequences of their actions. By appearing untouched, they avoid having to metabolize discomfort internally. Second, it destabilizes you. You humans are wired to read emotional cues. When someone causes pain and then behaves as if nothing happened, the nervous system searches for coherence and often finds it by self-blame. Third, it reasserts dominance. The one who appears least affected often appears most powerful. But this power is an illusion maintained through constant effort. Look closely and you'll notice that the performance is rigid. It lacks warmth. It feels strained even when it's quiet. Their composure is not relaxed, it is controlled. Their detachment is not peaceful, it is defensive. They are holding something down. This is why their calm can feel eerie. It doesn't soothe the room, it drains it. The silence they adopt after hurting you is not neutral. It is loaded. It communicates without words. I will not engage with this. I will not carry this. I will not acknowledge what just happened. And because humans are relational creatures, that refusal lands as rejection. You may find yourself trying to bridge the gap, explaining more clearly, softening your tone, taking responsibility for your feelings, all in the hope that the wall will come down. But the wall is not there to punish you. It is there to protect them. After harm, the narcissist's priority is not repair. It is containment. They must contain the emotional fallout, yours and theirs. And since they cannot regulate emotions internally, they regulate them externally by withdrawing, freezing, or projecting calm. This is not a conscious manipulation in most cases. It is an automatic defense. The moment discomfort threatens to break through, the performance begins. You might also notice something else during this phase. A subtle superiority, a faint smirk, a dismissive glance, a tone that suggests finality. These are not expressions of confidence. They are reinforcements of the role they are playing. If they can convince themselves and you that they are above the situation, they never have to enter it. This is why attempts at dialogue often fail here. The performance is incompatible with mutuality. Mutuality requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires presence. Presence would require them to feel. So they do the opposite. They become distant in a way that feels intentional but difficult to confront. If you push, they may accuse you of being dramatic, obsessive, or unable to let things go. If you withdraw, they may interpret it as confirmation that their strategy worked. Either way, and the performance remains intact. What makes this stage particularly painful is that it mimics emotional maturity. From the outside, it can look like restraint, like emotional regulation, like strength. Others may even praise their composure while quietly wondering why you are still affected. But composure without accountability is not maturity. It is avoidance dressed up as control. Healthy people can remain calm while still acknowledging impact. They can hold themselves steady while holding space for another's pain. They can say, "I can sit with this." The narcissist's performance says something else entirely. "I refuse to be touched by this." That refusal has consequences. Because emotions that are not processed do not disappear, they go underground, and what goes underground begins to shape behavior indirectly. Irritability, passive aggression, sudden coldness, a need to reassert dominance in subtle ways. The performance may look clean on the surface, but it creates internal pressure that leaks out elsewhere. This is often when the dynamic becomes most confusing. You sense tension, but there is no overt conflict. You feel distance, but no explanation. You feel blamed without being accused. The performance creates a reality where nothing is said, but everything is felt, and you are left asking yourself questions that have no satisfying answers. Did I imagine the harm? Am I being unreasonable? Why does it feel like I'm the only one affected? Those questions are not signs of weakness. They are the natural response to relational invalidation. The performance after they hurt you is not about closure. It is about erasure. Erasure of the moment. Erasure of the impact. Erasure of your emotional reality. And when that erasure is successful, it spares them from having to change, but it also creates a quiet imbalance that cannot sustain intimacy. Because intimacy requires repair. Repair requires acknowledgement. And acknowledgement requires stepping out of the role and into the truth. The narcissist cannot do that without risking the collapse of the persona they depend on. So they stay in character. Even when you disengage, the performance often continues. They may act as if nothing happened. They may move forward without reference to the rupture. They may even appear relieved. But that relief is not resolution. It is temporary containment. The underlying tension remains unresolved, shaping future interactions. This is why patterns repeat. Without repair, the same dynamics resurface, and new incidents are layered on top of old ones. The performance resets, but the emotional debt accumulates, and eventually the cost becomes too high for one person to carry alone. Understanding this is crucial because it reframes what you witnessed. The coldness was not proof that you overreacted. The calm was not evidence that the issue was trivial. The silence was not closure. It was a role designed to keep them intact at the expense of the relationship. And once you see it as a performance, not a reflection of truth, you stop trying to earn a reaction from it. You stop mistaking composure for conscience. You stop chasing validation from someone who is unavailable by design. The performance loses its power the moment you stop interpreting it as reality. Because reality is not what is shown on the surface. Reality is what is avoided. Even what they avoid, accountability, vulnerability, emotional presence, is precisely what you were asking for. In the next stage, you'll begin to see how this performance sets the groundwork for something deeper and more unsettling. Because what cannot be processed turns into something else, and what they suppress after hurting you does not vanish. It transforms. The guilt they bury, not erase. There is a common belief that narcissists feel no guilt, that after the damage, after the lies or betrayal or abandonment, they simply move on untouched. This belief is comforting because it creates a clean moral divide. You feel, they don't. You suffer, they escape. But psychological reality is rarely that simple. the truth is more unsettling and far more revealing. They do feel guilt. They just cannot afford to know that they do. In the guilt a narcissist experiences is not the kind that rises to the surface, asks for forgiveness, and leads to change. It does not unfold in language. It does not settle into reflection. Instead, it fractures. It is buried, compartmentalized, and pushed into the deepest corners of their psyche, where it continues to exist without ever being integrated. This is the guilt they bury, not erase. Guilt in a healthy psychological system serves a purpose. It alerts us to harm. It creates internal tension that motivates repair. It allows us to acknowledge I caused pain without collapsing into self-hatred. But this requires an internal structure capable of holding contradiction, capable of saying I am flawed and I am still worthy. The narcissist does not have that structure. For them, guilt does not arrive as a signal. It arrives as a threat. It carries the same charge as shame, inadequacy, and exposure. To feel guilt fully would require admitting fault. Admitting fault would require recognizing another person as real, separate, and impacted, and recognizing that impact would force them to confront a self-image they cannot tolerate. So guilt is intercepted before it can be consciously processed. Instead of becoming awareness, it becomes tension. That tension has to go somewhere. This is where rationalization begins. You may have heard it in subtle forms woven into conversations that left you feeling disoriented rather than reassured. Statements that seem explanatory on the surface but hollow underneath. You're too sensitive. You misunderstood my intentions. I had no choice. That's not what really happened. These are not simply excuses offered to you, they are internal negotiations. Each one functions as a psychological sedative, dulling the sting of responsibility just enough to restore equilibrium. The goal is not truth. The goal is relief, and relief is achieved by distorting reality. What makes this especially painful is that these rationalizations often contain fragments of plausibility. They are not outright fabrications. They are partial truths arranged to obscure the whole. This makes them hard to challenge without seeming defensive or argumentative, and over time you may find yourself conceding small points just to keep the conversation going. That concession is costly, and because each time the narrative bends to accommodate their avoidance, the guilt is displaced further outward. It moves away from them and toward you. You begin carrying what they cannot hold. You absorb the uncertainty, the doubt, the unresolved tension. This is how buried guilt becomes relationally toxic. The narcissist's psyche cannot integrate guilt, so it externalizes it. They project responsibility onto circumstances, onto misunderstandings, onto your reactions. In some cases, they even reverse roles entirely, positioning themselves as the injured party. This inversion is not strategic in the way most people imagine. It is defensive. It allows them to feel morally intact without examining their behavior. But the guilt does not disappear. It leaks. It shows up as irritability when challenged, as disproportionate anger when boundaries are set, as contempt toward vulnerability, as a chronic need to be right, as hypersensitivity to criticism. Each of these reactions is an attempt to keep buried guilt from resurfacing. This is why narcissists often seem more disturbed by being confronted than by causing harm. Confrontation threatens to unearth what has been sealed away. It disrupts the fragile balance they've established between self-image and reality. And because the guilt is never resolved, it accumulates. Unprocessed guilt doesn't soften over time. It hardens. It becomes resentment. It becomes bitterness. It becomes a constant internal pressure that demands release. And because they cannot direct it inward without destabilizing their identity, it is directed outward, toward you, toward others, toward the world. And this is one of the reasons narcissistic behavior often escalates rather than resolves. Each avoided reckoning adds another layer of internal tension. Each rationalization deepens the split between who they are and who they believe themselves to be. And the more that split widens, the more aggressive the defenses become. From the outside, it can look like indifference. From the inside, it feels like running. You may wonder why, if guilt exists at all, it never translates into accountability. Why it never leads to an apology that feels real. Why it never becomes repair. The answer lies in the difference between feeling and integrating. The narcissist may feel flashes of guilt, brief, disorganized, overwhelming, but they lack the capacity to stay with that feeling long enough for it to transform into insight. So the system shuts it down, and it is disowned before it can be named. This is also why moments of vulnerability, when they do occur, feel fleeting and unstable. You might catch glimpses of regret or sadness, only to see them vanish moments later, replaced by defensiveness or withdrawal. Those glimpses are not performances, they are cracks, and cracks are dangerous to a structure built on denial. So the wall goes back up. Understanding this reframes something essential. Their lack of remorse was not proof that the harm was imaginary. Their refusal to acknowledge fault was not evidence that you were wrong. Their silence was not moral certainty, it was avoidance. Avoidance of guilt that exists but cannot be held. This does not mean you were meant to stay. It does not mean you were meant to wait for them to integrate what they have buried. And it means you encountered a system that protects itself at the cost of truth. And here is the most important distinction. Guilt that is buried does not disappear on its own. It continues to shape behavior, relationships, and inner life. It follows them, unresolved, into every new dynamic. But you are not required to carry it for them. You were never meant to absorb what they refuse to face. As we move forward, you'll begin to see how this buried guilt doesn't just stay internal. It drives reactions to your pain, your growth, and especially your independence. Because nothing threatens a buried truth more than someone who no longer participates in the illusion that keeps it hidden. Why your pain threatens their identity. Your pain is not just an emotional response to what happened. For the narcissist, it is a psychological event, and it carries information they cannot afford to receive. And this is why, the moment you express hurt with clarity, without chaos, without apology for existing, the dynamic shifts in a way that feels sudden and hostile. Because your pain is not passive. It points, it reflects, it exposes. And what it exposes is not simply a mistake, but a contradiction at the core of their identity. Narcissistic identity is not built around mutual recognition. It is built around a carefully maintained image of coherence, superiority, or moral justification. Whether they see themselves as exceptional, misunderstood, or perpetually wronged, the common thread is this: their self-concept must remain intact and unchallenged. It cannot tolerate evidence that disrupts the story they tell themselves about who they are. Your pain does exactly that. When you articulate hurt, you do more than describe an experience. You assert that something real happened between two people. You affirm that actions had consequences. You implicitly state that your inner world matters and that it was impacted by theirs. This is where the threat emerges, because to accept your pain as legitimate, the narcissist would have to accept that they caused it, and to accept that, they would have to reconcile two incompatible self-images: the person they believe themselves to be and the person who inflicted harm. That reconciliation requires humility, accountability, and emotional integration. Capacities their identity structure does not support. So instead of integrating your pain, they neutralize it. They dismiss it, they minimize it, they reframe it as exaggeration, manipulation, or misunderstanding. Not because your pain is unclear, but because it is too clear. Your pain functions like a mirror they did not consent to look into. It reflects back something they have spent years avoiding: the reality of their impact. And for someone whose sense of self depends on avoiding internal contradiction, that reflection feels destabilizing. This is why the narcissist often reacts more strongly to your pain than to your anger. Anger can be dismissed as volatility. Pain is harder to invalidate. Pain is grounded. Pain is specific. Pain carries moral weight. It says this mattered. I was affected. Something here requires acknowledgement. That requirement is intolerable. So they attempt to control the meaning of your pain instead. They may suggest you're overreacting. They may accuse you of being dramatic. They may claim you're trying to guilt them. Each of these responses serves the same purpose: to reposition your pain as a problem you have, rather than a signal they need to face. But underneath these defenses is a deeper fear. Your pain threatens to dismantle the false self. The false self is not a conscious lie. It is a psychological construction designed to protect against shame and inadequacy. It presents as confidence, detachment, or moral certainty, but it is brittle. It depends on external validation and internal denial to remain stable. Your pain introduces evidence that the false self is incomplete. It suggests that beneath the image is a person capable of harm, that beneath the narrative is a relational failure, that beneath the control is a vulnerability they cannot master, and once that possibility enters the room, the narcissist must act quickly to contain it. This is why you may notice sudden shifts when you express hurt calmly. The conversation derails. The tone changes. They may become cold, sarcastic, or abruptly disengaged. These reactions are not proportional to what you said. They are proportional to what your pain represents. It represents loss of control over the narrative. It represents exposure without consent. It represents a crack in the identity they rely on to function. And here is the most painful paradox of all. The more honest and regulated your expression of pain becomes, the more threatening it feels to them. Chaos can be dismissed. Clarity cannot. When you cry hysterically, they can label you unstable. When you speak quietly and clearly, they are forced to confront meaning. This is why many people feel punished for healing while still in proximity to a narcissist. And as you become more grounded, more self-assured, more precise in your language, the reactions intensify. What feels like growth to you feels like rebellion to them. Not because you are attacking, but because you are no longer participating in distortion. Your pain also threatens something else: their moral positioning. Narcissists often rely on an internal hierarchy where they occupy the role of the justified one. Even when they behave destructively, they maintain a sense of being right, necessary, or provoked. Your pain destabilizes that hierarchy by introducing the possibility that they were not the injured party, but the injuring one. That reversal is dangerous to them, so they resist it with everything they have. They may counter with their own suffering, they may bring up past grievances, they may claim you've hurt them more. And this is not an attempt at mutual understanding. It is an attempt to regain moral footing, to restore a version of reality where they are not required to sit with the weight of your experience. And because your pain cannot be erased outright, they attempt to exhaust it. They wait you out, they stonewall, they disengage until you stop bringing it up. This is not resolution, it is attrition. They are betting that over time you will grow tired of carrying the discomfort alone, that you will soften the truth to preserve the connection, that you will prioritize peace over accuracy. Many people do, but when you don't, when you continue to hold your experience as valid without demanding their validation, the threat escalates. Because now your pain is not just an emotional signal. It is a declaration of independence. It says, I know what happened. I trust my perception. I do not need you to rewrite this for me. That statement, whether spoken or embodied, strikes at the core of narcissistic identity. It removes their ability to define reality for you. And without that control, the false self begins to wobble. This is why your pain is met not with empathy but with resistance, not with care but with containment. Not because you are asking for too much, but because you are asking for something they cannot give without unraveling who they believe themselves to be. Understanding this is not about excusing the behavior. It is about locating it accurately. Your pain was never the problem. It was the evidence. Evidence that the relationship mattered. Evidence that impact occurred. Evidence that the persona was incomplete. And the moment you stop interpreting their defensiveness as a verdict on your worth, you reclaim something essential. Your right to name your reality without apology. Because pain that threatens a false identity is not weakness. It is truth. Envy, the emotion. No one talks about there is an emotion that quietly drives much of the narcissist's behavior, yet it rarely gets named because it doesn't fit the surface narrative. We're taught to believe narcissists feel superior, detached, even dismissive of others. But beneath that posture lies something far more corrosive and far more revealing. Envy. Not envy in the casual sense of wanting what someone else has, but a deeper, more destabilizing form. The kind that arises when another person embodies something you cannot generate within yourself. The kind that doesn't admire or motivate, but threatens identity. This is why your presence mattered more than you realized. Narcissists are not primarily provoked by weakness. They are provoked by wholeness, by emotional depth they cannot access, by authenticity they cannot sustain, by an inner coherence that does not rely on performance, validation, or control. When they encounter someone who feels grounded in themselves, it stirs something uncomfortable. Something they have spent their lives suppressing. Envy. This envy is rarely conscious. It doesn't arrive with the thought, "I wish I were like you." It arrives as irritation, contempt, restlessness. It shows up as subtle devaluation, withdrawal, or mockery. It disguises itself as criticism, superiority, or indifference. But underneath those defenses is a longing that feels unbearable to acknowledge. You had something they depended on but could not create. Emotional presence, the capacity for genuine connection, the ability to feel without collapsing. These qualities are not trivial. They represent psychological integration, something the narcissist lacks. And when they are confronted with it in another person, it creates an internal imbalance, because your existence quietly contradicts the story they tell themselves. If they are as superior, self-sufficient, or invulnerable as they believe, then why does your authenticity unsettle them? Why does your emotional clarity provoke discomfort rather than admiration? Why does your ability to grow, reflect, and connect feel like a threat? Envy answers those questions. It reveals that what they present as indifference is often a defensive response to comparison. Not comparison of status or success, but comparison of being. You did not threaten them by shining loudly. You threatened them by shining honestly. This is why the narcissist's response is rarely open hostility at first. Envy prefers subtlety. It erodes rather than confronts. It whispers instead of shouts. It appears as small comments that diminish your confidence, as lack of enthusiasm when you succeed, as emotional withdrawal when you express depth. None of this is random. These behaviors serve a purpose: to reduce the psychological distance between what you embody and what they fear they lack. If they can make you smaller, less certain, less expressive, the contrast softens. The envy quiets, temporarily, but here is the paradox. Even as they try to diminish you, they feed on you, they draw energy from your empathy, and they rely on your emotional responsiveness to stabilize their sense of self. Your attention, your care, your effort, all of it reassures them that they still matter, that they still have influence, that they still exist at the center of someone else's emotional world. This is why narcissistic envy is so conflicted. They resent what they need. They devalue what sustains them, and that tension creates a cycle that feels confusing from the outside. One moment they seem drawn to you, even dependent on you. The next they seem cold, dismissive, or subtly cruel. The push and pull is not about love or detachment. It is about regulating envy without confronting it. What makes this especially painful is that your best qualities often become the very things they attack, and your sensitivity becomes too much. Your insight becomes overthinking. Your integrity becomes rigidity. These redefinitions are not accurate assessments. They are distortions designed to neutralize the discomfort your strengths provoke. If your authenticity can be framed as a flaw, then it no longer highlights what they lack. But envy is not resolved through distortion. It intensifies when you grow. As you begin to reclaim yourself, setting boundaries, trusting your perceptions, withdrawing from emotional overfunctioning, the envy sharpens. Because now you are not only someone who possesses qualities they lack, you are someone who is no longer offering those qualities freely to them. This is when the dynamic often escalates. They may attempt to pull you back with sudden affection or praise. They may increase criticism or control. They may act wounded by your independence. These reactions are not expressions of attachment. They are expressions of loss of access, loss of influence, loss of a mirror that reflected something valuable back to them. Your independence exposes a painful truth. What they relied on was never something they owned, and envy does not tolerate that realization easily. It is important to understand this because it changes how you interpret what happened. When someone envies your emotional depth, they cannot simply celebrate it. Celebration would require humility. It would require acknowledging that another person has something meaningful to offer. For the narcissist, that acknowledgement threatens the hierarchy their identity depends on. So instead, they attempt to invert the hierarchy. They position themselves as superior, and they cast you as naive, excessive, or flawed. But this inversion is unstable. It requires constant reinforcement, and the more you step into your own clarity, the harder it becomes to maintain. This is why many people feel an inexplicable sense of hostility when they begin healing. Nothing overt has changed, yet the atmosphere shifts. The narcissist becomes colder, sharper, more dismissive. That shift is not about you pulling away emotionally, it is about you no longer shrinking psychologically. Your wholeness disrupts the illusion. And here is the crucial insight. Envy does not mean you were perfect. It means you were real. It means you were integrated in ways they are not. It means you possessed an inner stability that did not require domination or distortion to maintain. That is not a burden you were meant to carry, and it is not something you need to apologize for. And it is certainly not something you need to diminish to preserve someone else's comfort. The narcissist's envy is not evidence that you were lacking. It is evidence that you were full, and fullness is confronting to someone organized around emptiness. As we continue, you'll begin to see how this envy drives the next phase of the dynamic, the attempt to diminish, control, or reclaim what they fear losing. Because when envy goes unacknowledged, it doesn't dissolve. It seeks expression, and often that expression comes at the expense of the person who triggered it simply by being themselves. Why they tried to diminish you. They did not try to diminish you because you were weak. They tried to diminish you because you were becoming undeniable. This is one of the hardest truths to accept, because it runs counter to the story most people tell themselves after being slowly worn down in a narcissistic dynamic. When someone chips away at your confidence, questions your perceptions, or subtly undermines your strengths, it's natural to assume you must have done something wrong, that you were flawed, excessive, inadequate. But diminishment is not a response to deficiency. It is a response to threat. By the time the narcissist begins to erode you, something important has already happened internally. You have come to represent something they cannot tolerate, standing beside unaltered. Your emotional clarity, your independence of thought, your capacity for growth, these qualities don't simply coexist with their false self. They expose it, and exposure is dangerous. The narcissist's sense of stability depends on contrast, and they need to feel elevated, centered, justified. That feeling does not arise from inner coherence. It arises from comparison. Someone must be smaller, less certain, less grounded for their position to feel secure. When you stop fulfilling that role, when your sense of self strengthens rather than dissolves, the balance shifts. So they intervene. Diminishment is not always loud. In fact, it is most effective when it is quiet. It arrives disguised as humor, concern, realism, or just being honest. A comment here, a withdrawal there, a lack of enthusiasm at precisely the moment you step into your own authority. Over time, these moments accumulate, and you begin to feel subtly off balance, as if you are always slightly miscalibrated. That is by design. The narcissist does not want to destroy you outright. They want to regulate you and to bring you back into a psychological position that feels manageable. A version of you that doubts yourself enough to remain tethered, but not so much that you disappear entirely, because disappearing would deprive them of what they still need. Your emotional availability, your responsiveness, your willingness to engage, this is where the paradox deepens. They diminish what they rely on. They undermine the very qualities that stabilize them because those same qualities threaten to surpass them. This internal conflict creates a pattern that feels incoherent from the outside but makes perfect sense psychologically. They criticize your sensitivity, then resent your emotional withdrawal. They dismiss your insight, then depend on your understanding. They belittle your independence, then panic when you detach. And what they are trying to manage is not you. They are trying to manage the gap between who they are and who they pretend to be. When that gap feels too wide, they pull you down rather than climb up. Diminishment is a shortcut. It is far easier to erode another person's confidence than to build one's own integrity. Growth requires humility. It requires facing limitation. It requires tolerating discomfort without displacing it. The narcissist does not have access to those capacities, so they choose the path of least resistance. They distort instead of develop. This distortion often takes the form of redefining your strengths as liabilities. Your thoughtfulness becomes overthinking. Your boundaries become selfishness. Your empathy becomes weakness. These redefinitions are not meant to help you improve, and they are meant to destabilize your internal compass. If you can no longer trust your own qualities, you become easier to influence. And influence is the goal. What makes this especially damaging is that the narcissist often positions themselves as the authority while doing this. They imply that they see something you don't, that they are offering insight, that their critique is grounded in realism or experience. And because you likely entered the relationship in good faith, you give those interpretations weight. You begin to shrink, not because you agree with them, but because you are trying to maintain connection. This is the quiet violence of diminishment. It does not announce itself as harm, it masquerades as guidance. But the underlying motivation is always the same: to neutralize the threat you pose by becoming more fully yourself. As your clarity grows, the diminishment intensifies, not necessarily in frequency, but in precision. They learn where you are most sensitive, where you most want to be seen, where your sense of self is still forming. And they apply pressure there, often indirectly, so that if you object, you appear defensive or insecure. This creates a double bind. If you accept the diminishment, you erode. If you resist it, you are framed as difficult. Either way, the focus shifts away from their behavior and onto your reaction. But here is the truth that often goes unspoken. People who feel secure do not need to make others feel small in order to feel large. They do not experience another person's growth as a threat. They do not need to recalibrate relationships through erosion. When someone thrives, they can tolerate the recalibration that growth demands. The narcissist cannot. Because your growth destabilizes the hierarchy their identity depends on. Your independence implies that they are not central. Your confidence implies that they are not authoritative. Your wholeness implies that they are not superior. Rather than face these implications, they attempt to reassert dominance by reducing you to a version of yourself that feels less challenging. And when that fails, when you continue to grow despite the pressure, the diminishment often gives way to more overt forms of control or withdrawal. This is not escalation for its own sake, it is desperation. They are trying to preserve a structure that no longer holds. And this is where many people misinterpret what is happening. They assume the narcissist is reacting to conflict, incompatibility, or emotional intensity. But what they are reacting to is loss of leverage, loss of the ability to define you, loss of the capacity to anchor their self-image through your uncertainty. Diminishment is the attempt to reverse that loss. Understanding this allows you to reframe the past with clarity rather than shame. The moments you were undermined were not evidence of your insufficiency. They were indicators of your expansion. The more you became yourself, the less the old dynamic could survive intact. That is not a personal failure, it is a structural incompatibility. And once you see diminishment for what it is, not critique, not realism, not truth, you stop internalizing it. You begin to recognize the pattern rather than personalize the content. You see that the goal was never improvement but containment, and you were not meant to be contained. You were meant to grow beyond the version of yourself that made someone else feel safe at the expense of your own coherence. As we move forward, this understanding becomes essential. Because the impulse to diminish does not exist in isolation. It feeds directly into the need for control and the panic that arises when control begins to slip. Control as a survival strategy. To understand the narcissist's obsession with control, you have to stop seeing it as a personality preference and start seeing it as a survival strategy. Control is not something they like, it is something they need. Without it, their internal world begins to fracture. For most people, control is situational. It helps us organize our lives, pursue goals, or manage uncertainty. We can loosen it when trust is present. We can relinquish it when connection feels safe. Control is flexible because the self beneath it is stable. For the narcissist, control is not flexible. It is structural. It is the scaffolding holding their identity together. Their sense of self is not anchored internally. It is propped up externally by influence, dominance, predictability, and emotional leverage over others. Control creates the illusion of coherence. It quiets the anxiety that comes from not knowing who they are without power over their environment. And people are the most important part of that environment. This is why control in narcissistic dynamics is rarely obvious at first. It does not always look like commands or aggression. More often, it looks like subtle regulation, shaping conversations, steering outcomes, defining what is reasonable, acceptable, or real, by deciding which emotions are valid and which are excessive. These behaviors are not random. They are attempts to stabilize an internal system that cannot tolerate uncertainty. When you are emotionally responsive, when you react predictably, when you seek their approval or explanation, the system holds. They feel oriented, grounded, real. But when you begin to act independently, when your reactions change, when your emotional center shifts inward rather than toward them, the system destabilizes. And this is where control intensifies because your autonomy introduces ambiguity, and ambiguity is intolerable. Independence signals unpredictability. It means they can no longer anticipate how you will respond, what you will tolerate, or whether their influence still holds. And that unpredictability threatens the fragile balance they depend on to feel intact. So they intervene. They may frame their control as concern, as guidance, as realism, as just trying to help. But the function is always the same: to reestablish emotional dominance and reduce uncertainty. If they can define the terms of the relationship, they can avoid confronting the internal void that opens when control slips. This is why boundaries feel so provocative to a narcissist. A boundary is not just a limit, it is a declaration that you are a separate psychological entity, that you have an internal authority they cannot override, that you can decide what is acceptable without consulting them. That declaration is destabilizing, because control for the narcissist is existential. It is not about outcomes, it is about identity. Without control, and they risk encountering the parts of themselves they have disowned: uncertainty, inadequacy, dependency, shame. So they respond with strategies designed to restore leverage. They may escalate criticism. They may withdraw affection. They may reassert superiority. They may provoke emotional reactions. Each tactic is an attempt to pull you back into a familiar role, reactive, uncertain, oriented around them. What they are really trying to control is not your behavior, but your perception. If they can influence how you interpret events, how you assess yourself, how you understand the dynamic, they retain power even in absence. Control becomes psychological rather than physical. This is why calm detachment is often more threatening than confrontation. Anger keeps you engaged. Defensiveness keeps you explaining. Silence keeps you guessing. But calm clarity, especially when it does not seek validation, removes their leverage entirely. It says, "I see what's happening and I don't need you to agree." That is catastrophic to a system built on dominance. When control fails, fear surfaces, not always as panic but as urgency. The narcissist may suddenly intensify efforts to reassert relevance. They may oscillate between charm and coldness, between engagement and withdrawal. These shifts are not expressions of emotional complexity. They are recalibration attempts. They are trying to regain footing, because without control, they are forced to face something they have spent their lives avoiding: internal emptiness. The absence of a stable self that can exist without regulating others. This is why narcissists often appear restless, dissatisfied, or agitated when they lose influence. They may seek new sources of validation, new relationships, new arenas where control can be reestablished. The pattern repeats because the underlying need remains unmet. Control is not soothing them, it is postponing reckoning. And here is where many people misinterpret what they are witnessing. They assume the narcissist's controlling behavior means they want closeness, reconciliation, or attachment. Sometimes that is partially true, but more often it is about possession, not connection. Control ensures relevance. It ensures that even if love is absent, influence remains. As long as you are reacting to them, emotionally, psychologically, internally, they are not alone with themselves. This is why the most profound shift occurs when you stop participating in the power struggle altogether. Not through hostility, not through argument, but through disengagement from the need to be understood by them. When you no longer need them to validate your experience, control collapses, because control requires consent, it requires engagement, it requires a willingness to orient around their responses. The moment you withdraw that orientation, the structure they rely on begins to fail. This does not always lead to visible collapse. Often it leads to increased defensiveness, dismissal, or indifference. But beneath those reactions is a deeper destabilization. The realization, often unconscious, that control was never the same as security, it was a substitute. Understanding control as a survival strategy reframes the entire dynamic. It shows you that their behavior was not about love, compatibility, or emotional truth, and it was about maintaining an internal equilibrium they could not achieve on their own. And it clarifies something essential for you. You were not resisting control because you were difficult. You were resisting it because you were becoming whole. Your boundaries were not provocations, they were signals of selfhood. Your independence was not abandonment, it was differentiation. Once you see control through this lens, you stop personalizing the pressure. You stop interpreting their reactions as evidence of your failure. You recognize them as symptoms of a system that depends on dominance to function, and you are no longer obligated to stabilize that system at your own expense. As we continue, this understanding becomes crucial, because when control begins to fail, the narcissist's response reveals something even more telling. Not strength, i.e., but fear. And that fear becomes most visible when you stop reacting altogether. What happens when you stop reacting? There comes a moment in this dynamic that feels deceptively quiet. Nothing dramatic happens on the surface. No confrontation, no final argument, no grand declaration. You simply stop reacting. And for the first time, the absence of your response speaks louder than anything you ever said. This moment is not accidental. It emerges after exhaustion, after clarity, after the slow realization that explaining yourself no longer brings understanding, and defending yourself no longer brings relief. You are not withdrawing to punish. You are withdrawing because something inside you has recalibrated. Your emotional center shifts back to where it always belonged, inside you, and that shift changes everything. Up until now, your reactions were part of the structure that kept the narcissistic system stable. Your questions, your pain, your attempts to repair, even your anger, all of it confirmed engagement. It signaled relevance. It reassured them that they still occupied a central place in your inner world. Reaction, even negative reaction, is still connection. When you stop reacting, that connection dissolves. At first, it may look like nothing happens. They may appear unfazed, calm, detached, almost relieved. This is misleading. What you are seeing is a brief moment of recalibration, not indifference. The system is scanning for familiar cues and not finding them. Because something essential has changed. Your silence is not empty, it is structured, it carries coherence. It does not seek permission. And that coherence is deeply unsettling to someone whose sense of self depends on controlling emotional outcomes. When you stop reacting, the narcissist loses their primary reference point. They can no longer predict you. Prediction is power. For years, they learned how to read your emotional rhythms, how to provoke reassurance, how to trigger self-doubt, how to pull you back into engagement. When those patterns no longer work, confusion sets in. And confusion is dangerous to a personality organized around control. This is why the next phase often feels erratic. They may test the waters with sudden warmth, a message that feels nostalgic, a compliment that seems sincere, a reminder of shared history. This is not reconciliation, it is a probe. They are checking to see if the old levers still function. If that fails, the tone may shift. A criticism may resurface, dismissiveness, subtle contempt, an attempt to provoke a reaction that restores the familiar dynamic. When even that doesn't work, something more revealing emerges. Anxiety, not always visible, not always dramatic, but present. Because your non-reaction is doing something they cannot tolerate, it is removing them from the position of psychological authority. You are no longer waiting for them to define what happened. You are no longer orienting your emotions around their responses. You are no longer seeking resolution through them. You are standing in your own reality. And that reality does not include them as the final arbiter of meaning. This is when the power imbalance quietly collapses, not because you confront them, not because you prove anything, but because you stop participating in the illusion that they control the emotional terrain. To the narcissist, This feels like a loss of gravity. They are no longer the sun around which your emotions orbit. And without that orbit, they are forced, however briefly, to confront something they have spent their lives avoiding, their own internal emptiness. This is why indifference, not anger, is the most destabilizing response. Anger keeps the bond alive. Pain invites engagement. Explanation implies hope. Indifference implies completion. But your indifference is not numbness. It is integration. It comes from understanding rather than repression. You are not suppressing feeling. You are no longer outsourcing it. And that distinction matters. When you stop reacting, you may notice an internal shift as well. The noise quiets, and the constant analysis fades. You stop replaying conversations. You stop needing their version of events to validate your experience. This is not detachment born of denial. It is detachment born of clarity. And clarity is threatening because it cannot be manipulated. The narcissist may attempt to reinterpret your silence. They may label it coldness, avoidance, or immaturity. This is projection. They are trying to regain narrative control by defining your boundary as a flaw. But notice something important. These labels only matter if you accept them. When you stop reacting internally as well as externally, their interpretations lose power. This is often the moment when the dynamic truly ends, not externally but psychologically. They may still exist in your environment. They may still attempt engagement. But the emotional circuitry that once made their behavior destabilizing is no longer active. You are no longer responding from the wound. You are responding, if at all, from choice. And choice changes the entire equation. For the narcissist, this loss of emotional access is profound. It removes the feedback loop that once stabilized their identity. They can no longer confirm their relevance through your reactions. They can no longer discharge internal tension through your emotional responses. And because they lack the capacity for self-soothing, this loss can feel disorienting. Some narcissists respond by seeking new sources of supply, new dynamics where the old patterns still work. Others double down, attempting to reassert control through escalation or withdrawal. But the key point is this: none of these responses are about you, and they are about restoring equilibrium. Your non-reaction has exposed something fragile. It has revealed that control was never mutual. It required your participation. And without that participation, it collapses. This is why stopping reacting is not passive. It is an active withdrawal of consent from a dynamic that depended on your emotional labor. It is not silence as avoidance. It is silence as boundary. And boundaries do not need explanation. You may notice guilt arise in yourself during this phase, a sense that you are being unkind, that you are withholding, that you are not being yourself. This guilt is a residue of conditioning. You were trained to equate engagement with morality, responsiveness with worth. But self-abandonment is not kindness, and your nervous system knows the difference. When you stop reacting, you are not disappearing. You are reappearing to yourself. You are reclaiming the energy that was once spent monitoring, adjusting, and accommodating someone else's emotional instability. This reclamation feels unfamiliar at first. Quiet can feel empty when you are used to chaos. But over time, the quiet becomes spacious, restorative, grounded. And this is the final truth of this phase. The narcissist's fear is not that you will leave. It is that you will leave internally, that you will no longer carry them with you, that you will no longer interpret yourself through their lens, that you will no longer react. Because when you stop reacting, the dynamic ends, not with drama, but with dignity. And dignity is something they cannot control. What follows next is not your responsibility. Their responses, their adjustments, and their attempts to reassert relevance, none of it requires your engagement. Your work is simpler, though not easier. You stay where you are, present, clear, untethered, and in that stillness, the illusion finally loses its hold. The emptiness they can't escape. When you finally step back, when your reactions quiet, your boundaries hold, and your emotional energy returns to you, something becomes unmistakably clear. What remains on the other side is not strength. It is not peace. It is emptiness. And no amount of performance, control, or substitution allows the narcissist to escape it. This emptiness is not the kind that comes from grief or loss. Those forms of emptiness can be filled with meaning, integrated through reflection, transformed by connection. The emptiness at the core of narcissism is different. It is structural, and it exists because the self was never allowed to form in a coherent, integrated way. Instead of a stable inner center, there is a hollow space where identity should be, kept at bay by validation, distraction, and dominance. For a long time, you unknowingly helped hold that emptiness at a distance. Your attention gave it shape. Your reactions gave it feedback. Your emotional availability gave it substance. When you were present, engaging, explaining, caring, the emptiness stayed quiet. It was masked by activity. It was filled temporarily by your responsiveness. And because this filling felt relieving, even stabilizing, the narcissist learned to rely on it without ever acknowledging the dependency. But emptiness that is merely covered does not disappear. It waits. When you stop reacting, when your emotional presence is no longer available to regulate their inner world, the emptiness returns with force. And this is where many people misread what happens next. They assume the narcissist's continued composure means they are unaffected, that they've simply replaced what was lost and moved on. In reality, what they are doing is fleeing the silence. The narcissist cannot remain alone with themselves for long. Solitude is not restorative. It is confrontational. In quiet moments, without an external mirror to reflect back importance, they come face to face with a void they do not know how to inhabit. There is no internal warmth to return to, no grounded sense of self to settle into. This is why distraction becomes a way of life. Constant activity, endless stimulation, new relationships, new projects, new sources of admiration. Yet each serves the same function, to keep the emptiness from becoming audible. But distraction is not fulfillment. It does not build depth. It only postpones awareness. And because the emptiness is internal, no external acquisition can resolve it. The relief is always temporary. The hunger always returns. This is why narcissists often appear perpetually dissatisfied, even when surrounded by markers of success. Achievements lose their meaning quickly. Relationships feel shallow. Praise fades faster than expected. Nothing lasts long enough to anchor them because the anchor was never built. And this is the tragedy at the center of the dynamic. The narcissist wants what everyone wants, to feel real, valued, and connected. But instead of cultivating those states internally, they attempt to extract them externally. And they treat other people as mirrors rather than as separate beings. And when a mirror steps away, when you stop reflecting back validation or emotional engagement, the emptiness becomes unavoidable. What they experience in those moments is not sadness in the ordinary sense. It is a low-grade panic, a restless agitation, a sense that something is missing but cannot be named. Because naming it would require acknowledging dependency, vulnerability, and need. And those acknowledgments feel intolerable, so they keep moving. They may present a polished exterior, they may appear socially active, confident, even admired, but beneath that surface is a constant churn, a need to stay ahead of the feeling that threatens to surface if they slow down. This is why the narcissist often seems incapable of sustained intimacy. Intimacy requires stillness, and it requires being known without performance. It requires tolerating the quiet presence of another person without needing to control the exchange. The emptiness cannot tolerate that. When intimacy deepens, it brings the internal void into sharper contrast. The closer the connection, the more obvious the lack of internal grounding becomes, and rather than face that lack, the narcissist distances, sabotages, or devalues the relationship. It is not that they do not want closeness. It is that closeness exposes what they cannot bear to see. Your departure, especially your emotional departure, forces this exposure. Without your energy filling the space, the emptiness echoes louder. And while they may never articulate this experience consciously, their behavior reveals it. The restlessness, the sudden need for attention, and the quick replacement of one dynamic with another. None of this brings peace, because peace requires integration. It requires the capacity to sit with oneself without fleeing, and that capacity was never developed. This is why the narcissist's life often feels fragmented. Relationships overlap or end abruptly. Goals shift without fulfillment. Satisfaction remains just out of reach. On the surface, things may look impressive or even enviable. Internally, there is a chronic sense of dissatisfaction, a feeling that something essential is missing. And it is. What is missing is a stable sense of self that does not depend on external regulation. This is not something another person can provide. It is not something love, patience, or sacrifice can fix. It requires a willingness to face the emptiness directly, to grieve what was never built, and to tolerate the vulnerability that comes with starting that work later in life. Most narcissists do not choose this path, not because they are incapable of understanding it intellectually, but because it demands a level of humility and emotional exposure that feels existentially threatening. It would mean admitting that the strategies they relied on, control, dominance, image, were compensations, not solutions. And so the emptiness remains. This understanding is not meant to evoke pity. It is meant to bring clarity. Because once you see that the emptiness was never yours to fill, you stop trying to compensate for it. You stop believing that if you had loved differently, explained better, or stayed longer, the outcome would have changed. It wouldn't have. You were not abandoning them when you stepped back, but you were refusing to continue functioning as a substitute self. And that refusal is not cruelty. It is self-preservation. The emptiness they cannot escape is not a punishment inflicted by your absence. It is the natural consequence of a life built around avoidance. And while it may follow them from relationship to relationship, it does not need to follow you. This is where your path diverges. You are capable of sitting with discomfort, of integrating loss, of learning from pain rather than running from it. You are capable of building a self that does not require extraction to feel real. And that capacity, the very one that made you valuable to the narcissist, is now the one that allows you to move forward without them. The emptiness they carry does not define you. It explains them. And once you understand that, you are free to stop trying to fill a space that was never meant to be yours to hold. What their silence really means for you. There is a particular kind of silence that follows narcissistic harm, and it is unlike ordinary quiet. It is not the silence of reflection, not the pause of someone gathering the courage to speak. It is a silence that feels deliberate, weighted, and strangely loud. And if you don't understand what it truly means, it can become one of the most damaging parts of the entire experience. Because silence in this context invites interpretation. When they go silent, your mind instinctively searches for meaning. You replay conversations. You scan your memory for mistakes. You wonder what you should have said differently, what tone you should have used, what moment you might have salvaged. And the silence seems to ask a question, and the most painful part is that you feel responsible for answering it. This is where many people get trapped. They assume silence means certainty. They assume silence means indifference, They assume silence means you were easily forgotten. But that assumption places the weight in the wrong place. Their silence is not a verdict on your worth. It is a reflection of their avoidance. What their silence really means is that engagement has become psychologically unsafe for them. Speaking would require acknowledgement. Acknowledgement would require accountability, and accountability would force them to confront truths they cannot tolerate without destabilizing the identity they depend on. So they choose silence. Not because there is nothing to say, but because there is too much. In their silence is an absence of language, not an absence of impact. It is the space where explanation should be but cannot exist. And because you are a meaning-making person, that absence can feel unbearable. You want resolution, you want clarity, you want something solid to hold on to so that the pain makes sense. Silence offers none of that. Instead, it tempts you into filling the gap yourself. You may tell yourself that if you mattered more, they would have tried, that if the connection was real, they would have fought for it. That their quiet departure is proof that the relationship was an illusion. But this conclusion is built on a false premise. People who are capable of repair do not use silence as an ending. They may need time, but they return. They clarify. They take responsibility for their part. The silence that never resolves is not strength. It is avoidance crystallized. The narcissist's silence functions as a final defense. It allows them to exit without reckoning. It allows them to preserve their self-image. It allows them to avoid witnessing the consequences of their behavior. And in doing so, it transfers the emotional burden to you. You carry the unanswered questions. You carry the unresolved tension. You carry the work of integration alone. This is why their silence can feel more painful than their presence. Presence, even when flawed, offers material to process. Silence leaves you alone with ambiguity, and ambiguity is fertile ground for self-blame. But here is what their silence does not mean. It does not mean you imagined the connection. It does not mean your pain was excessive. It does not mean you were unworthy of effort. And in fact, the silence often indicates the opposite. Silence appears when engagement would threaten the narcissist's defenses. It appears when they cannot control the outcome of the conversation. It appears when they sense that speaking might expose them, to themselves or to you. If you truly had no impact, silence would not be necessary. Indifference would be easy. Casual dismissal would suffice. Silence becomes necessary when words might reveal too much. This is why silence feels so final. It is designed to close the door without looking back. But that closure is one-sided. And this is where your interpretation matters. If you interpret their silence as a measure of your value, you remain psychologically tethered to them. Their absence continues to define you. Their refusal to speak continues to shape your self-concept. You remain in relationship even without contact. But if you interpret their silence accurately, as an expression of limitation rather than superiority, the dynamic changes. You begin to see that silence is not an answer. It is a refusal to engage with reality, a refusal to tolerate discomfort, a refusal to acknowledge another person's inner world. And refusal is information. It tells you what is possible and what is not. Their silence tells you that they cannot meet you in truth, that they cannot offer the kind of acknowledgement that leads to healing, that waiting for their words will keep you suspended in a place they have already left. This is not an easy realization. It requires grieving not just the relationship, but the fantasy that clarity would come from them, that one more conversation would make sense of everything, that if you waited long enough they would finally explain. But silence does not ripen into understanding. It calcifies, and understanding must come from somewhere else. This is where the meaning of their silence shifts, from something that wounds you to something that frees you. When you stop asking what their silence says about you and start asking what it reveals about them, the narrative reorients. You no longer need their voice to validate your experience. You no longer need their acknowledgement to confirm that harm occurred. You begin to trust what you lived. This does not mean the silence stops hurting immediately. It means the hurt stops defining you. You stop reading their quiet as rejection and start reading it as incapacity. Not as punishment, but as limitation. Not as power, but as retreat. And with that shift, something important happens. You reclaim authorship of your story. You no longer wait for an ending they cannot provide. You no longer suspend your healing for their readiness. You no longer interpret their absence as evidence that you failed. Instead, you allow the silence to stand as what it is, a boundary they erected because they could not step forward. And then you do something different. You speak to yourself. You name what happened without distortion. You honor your pain without minimizing it. You integrate the experience without their participation. This is not closure in the conventional sense. It is something deeper. It is self-trust. Self-trust is what silence was designed to erode. When you restore it, the silence loses its authority. It becomes background noise rather than a defining feature. It stops echoing. And here is the final quiet truth. Silence does not mean nothing happened. It means something happened that they cannot face. And the fact that you can face it, that you can reflect, grieve, and grow, tells you something essential about the difference between you and them. Their silence marks the edge of their capacity. Your understanding marks the beginning of yours. You were not left without answers because you were unworthy of them. You were left without answers because the person who hurt you could not survive giving them. And once you understand that, you no longer wait in the quiet. You move forward, carrying your truth with you, intact. The final reversal. Your healing is the proof. They can't deny there is a moment that arrives quietly, almost without ceremony. It doesn't announce itself with triumph or drama, and it arrives as steadiness, as breath returning to your body, as the realization that you are no longer organizing your inner world around someone who could not meet you there. This is the final reversal, and it is the one outcome the narcissist cannot control, distort, or erase. Your healing. For a long time, the dynamic revolved around their gravity. Their reactions set the tone. Their silence shaped the narrative. Their approval, withdrawal, or dismissal seemed to determine what was real. You were pulled into a world where meaning flowed outward from them and back into you, filtered through doubt, confusion, and self-questioning. Healing reverses that flow, not loudly, not vindictively, but decisively. Healing means you stop asking whether your pain was justified and start trusting that it was real. And it means you no longer measure your worth by how deeply you were affected, but by how honestly you are now living. It means the questions that once kept you awake. Why wasn't I enough? Why didn't they care? Why did it end like this? Lose their urgency. Not because they were answered by the person who caused the harm, but because you no longer need their answers to move forward. This is where the reversal happens. Everything the narcissist relied on begins to fail. They depended on your uncertainty. They depended on your need for validation. They depended on your emotional availability to stabilize their inner world. Healing removes that dependency, not by confrontation, but by completion. When you heal, you are no longer arguing with the past. You are no longer rehearsing explanations. You are no longer trying to prove what happened. But you are living in a body that feels safer, a mind that feels clearer, and a life that is expanding rather than contracting. And that expansion is undeniable, because it doesn't need permission. The narcissist may never admit fault. They may never acknowledge your pain. They may continue to tell a story where they were justified, misunderstood, or unaffected. But your healing quietly dismantles that story. not by contradicting it, but by making it irrelevant. You are no longer reacting to them. You are responding to your own life. This is the part that unsettles the most, not consciously perhaps, but psychologically, because your healing does something their defenses cannot account for. It demonstrates that the control they believed they had was conditional. It existed only as long as you participated in it. And now you don't. You are no longer mirroring their importance back to them. You are no longer carrying their unresolved guilt, shame, or confusion. You are no longer holding the emotional weight they refuse to face. Your healing exposes a truth they cannot deny, even if they never name it. You were not broken by the relationship. You were constrained by it, and once freed, you did not collapse. You integrated. This is the final reversal because it inverts every assumption the dynamic was built on. The narcissist believed you needed them more than they needed you. Healing reveals the opposite. They believed your pain meant weakness. Healing reframes it as capacity, the capacity to feel, to reflect, to grow. They believed silence would diminish you. Healing gives you voice, even when you choose not to speak to them. They believed distance would erase you. Healing allows you to exist without reference to them at all. This is not revenge, it is resolution, and it is important to understand why this matters, not for them, but for you. Healing is not about becoming indifferent in a cold or detached way. It is about becoming whole, about reclaiming the parts of yourself that were fragmented by constant vigilance, self-doubt, and emotional labor. It is about restoring your internal authority, the sense that you can trust your perceptions, honor your needs, and set limits without explanation. This internal authority is what the narcissistic dynamic undermined most effectively. It trained you to look outward for confirmation of reality. Healing trains you to look inward again. And once that shift happens, something profound settles in. You stop trying to be understood by someone who avoids understanding. You stop waiting for accountability from someone who cannot tolerate it. You stop hoping for closure from someone whose silence was the closure. You begin living forward. This forward movement is not loud. It is not performative. It does not need to be displayed or announced. In fact, the most powerful healing often looks ordinary from the outside. You sleep better. You laugh more easily. You make choices without over-explaining them. You feel sadness without drowning in it. You feel joy without bracing for loss. These changes may seem small, but they are seismic, because they reflect an inner coherence that cannot be manipulated. The narcissist may sense this shift even if they don't understand it. They may feel a vague loss of relevance, a sense that something they once influenced is no longer accessible. This can provoke attempts to reinsert themselves through nostalgia, provocation, or dismissal. But by this point, the ground has shifted. You are no longer standing in the old terrain. Your healing is the proof they cannot deny because it requires nothing from them. It does not need their apology. It does not need their recognition. It does not even need their absence. Only your clarity, and clarity is irreversible. Once you see the dynamic for what it was, you cannot unsee it. Once you experience life outside the constant push and pull, you cannot convince yourself it was healthy. Once your nervous system learns safety, it does not easily return to chaos. This is why healing feels both liberating and sobering. You grieve what was lost. You grieve what was never possible. But you also reclaim what was always yours. Your time, your energy, your sense of self. The final reversal is not that they realize what they lost. It is that you realize what you regained. You regain authorship over your story. You regain the ability to invest in relationships that do not require self-erasure. You regain the freedom to be complex, emotional, thoughtful, and grounded without being diminished for it. And perhaps most importantly, you regain trust in yourself. Trust that your pain meant something. Trust that your boundaries were necessary. Trust that walking away, emotionally or physically, was not a failure but a correction. This trust is the foundation of everything that comes next. The narcissist may continue living inside defenses, illusions, and substitutions. They may repeat patterns, seeking relief without integration. That path is no longer yours. Your path is different now. It is quieter. It is clearer. It is yours. And that is the truth. No performance, no silence, no narrative manipulation can undo. Your healing stands as living evidence. Not that you were unaffected, but that you were capable. Capable of facing what they avoided, capable of integrating what they buried, capable of becoming whole where they remained fragmented. That is the final reversal, and it is not something they get to respond to. It is something you get to live. Conclusion: what this story was really about. At its core, this story was never just about a narcissist. It was about a human journey through confusion, erosion, awakening, and finally reclamation. It began in a place many people recognize: connection that felt intense, meaningful, and consuming. There was hope, emotional investment, and the belief that if you tried hard enough, explained better, loved deeper, stayed calmer, the bond would eventually stabilize. But instead of safety, the relationship became a psychological maze. Pain was followed by silence. Closeness was followed by withdrawal. Truth was followed by distortion. Over time, the damage was not only what was done to the protagonist, but what the protagonists slowly did to themselves in response. Self-trust eroded. Intuition was questioned. Emotions were minimized. Reality became negotiable. The narcissistic dynamic thrived not because of cruelty alone, but because of confusion. Because when meaning is unclear, people turn inward and assume fault. The turning point in this story did not come through confrontation or victory, and it came through exhaustion and clarity. The moment when the protagonist stopped reacting was not an act of defeat, but an act of return. Emotional energy that had been siphoned outward came back home. Silence was no longer interpreted as a verdict, but as a limitation. The narcissist's absence stopped being a measure of worth and started being information. What followed was not instant peace, but something more durable. Integration. The protagonist learned to sit with discomfort without outsourcing it, to face grief without needing validation from the person who caused it, to rebuild identity not in opposition to the narcissist, but independent of them. And in doing so, something irreversible happened. Healing took root. The narcissist remained trapped in patterns, performance, avoidance, substitution, but the protagonist moved forward, not louder, not harder, just clearer. This is the quiet ending most people don't expect, but it is the most honest one. The story did not end with apology or accountability. It ended with self-trust, and that is the real resolution. The deeper lesson, and how to apply it. The deepest lesson of this story is this: your healing does not require another person's understanding, remorse, or participation. Many people stay stuck because they believe closure comes from being acknowledged by the one who hurt them. But in reality, closure comes from no longer needing that acknowledgement to validate your experience. When you stop waiting for someone else to confirm your reality, you reclaim your authority. Applied to real life, this means learning to recognize patterns instead of personalizing behavior. And it means understanding that someone's inability to show empathy is not proof that you were too much. It is proof that they were limited. It means setting boundaries without over-explaining them. It means choosing environments, relationships, and habits that do not require self-erasure to maintain peace. Most importantly, it means trusting your nervous system. If something consistently leaves you anxious, confused, or diminished, that information matters. Healing begins when you stop overriding yourself to preserve connection. You don't need to harden. You don't need to become indifferent. You need to become aligned. Aligned with your values, aligned with your emotional truth, aligned with a life that expands instead of contracts. That alignment is the opposite of narcissistic damage. And once you experience it, you will never confuse chaos with love again. Quick question for you. Which do you think is more powerful in healing from a narcissistic relationship? A. Finally getting an apology and explanation. B. Reaching a place where you no longer need one. Comment A or B below. I'm really curious to see what you think. And now I want to hear from you. What part of this story resonated with your own experience? What insight stayed with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your perspective too. If this content helped you see your experience more clearly, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support makes it possible to keep creating deeper, more honest conversations like this.